So, of course, the title is a bit provocative, but you will see there is some ground about that because, like you, like everyone, I read in the newspapers some time ago comments about palm oil industry, palm oil issues, and neocolonialism. So we are going to see if it is the case. And of course, we are all in the middle of the the COVID, still not post. In Malaysia, we are still in the middle of the COVID issues, post-COVID, and we already see the signs of a post-COVID era that we can discern from the economics or the economic science. So I will share that with you. So first, let me start away from the beginning, discuss the question of the deforestation. Can we really avoid imported deforestation by regulating palm oil trade? That is one of the main subjects that everyone always hear with the ban or the regulations and so on. So let's see very quickly. So this is a graph of a few years ago that show you the CPO World Trade in details. You know, all the countries, all the flows of the trade only, and of course, quite a significant share of that is going to Europe. And at that time, I was working on the question: is France having an impact on the imported deforestation? And you see a red line for France. So I pass very quickly on that to give you very quickly those quick information that some of you have seen already, and then I will delve into the new stuff. So if you look at the refined oil, you have a very similar picture. Now we are going to take some time on the real Malaysian deforestation by oil palm. So first, you have in black by 5 years an average of the annual forest loss every year, but averaged by 5 years since the 50s up to now in Malaysia. And you see that it's a kind of asymmetric bell curve that peaked around 1970, 1975. So quite a long time ago. And since this peak time, it has been regularly decreasing. And if you put the palm oil extension trend in relation to this, then this is what you look at. And this is the everyday new, every year new area of palm oil extension in Malaysia. And what is striking when you look at this figure is actually palm oil extension started to really become important after the peak or in the same time of the peak. And at the beginning of the real phase of deforestation, palm oil was inexistent. And now that deforestation is almost inexistent in Malaysia, palm oil extension has continued a bit. So that is fascinating, but it's not surprising. It is because most of the deforestation in Malaysia was earlier created by the extension of rubber wood. And in fact, if you look at this greenish bell curve, this is the deforestation that you can compute, which half of it is by oil palm and half of it is by rubber. And the deforestation before was not by oil palm at all. And now this is the black line is what we computed with my teams. But if you look at the media, if you go on Google, if you search in the web, you may find different numbers, especially, for example, the numbers of the Global Forest Watch, which I consult myself regularly. But you see that the red line is the deforestation number by the Global Forest Watch, and this is very different from the black line that we have. So you may question who is right, who is wrong, because those figures are very, very different. So I'm not here to blame anyone. I'm just here to explain the facts and see why we may have a discrepancy. So if we focus on those numbers, those from the website of the Global Forest Watch, actually, if you add all of them year by year from 2000, it is adding up to a minimum of 2.15 million hectares of primary forest lost since 2000. And that's not nothing, it's a huge amount. And that is just the conservative figure, because they have also other numbers that are even higher if you look at the tree covers. So now, if you compare that to a very serious work that was published by us in 2015, this is the evolution in Malaysia of the agricultural area, the forest evolution, so the axis is in million hectares. And so you see the forest, excluding Sarawak, was decreasing. You see the total forest was decreasing. You have a dashed line, which is the forest computed, because we don't have exact number for that, but we can reconstitute them. And the total of this was finishing in 2015. And I added with a little bracket on the far right, what is the scientific uncertainty for today in 2020. So you have the minimum and the maximum of what you can compute today. So that is the real extent of the forest today in Malaysia, as we compute with my team by scientific ways. And of course, you have some uncertainty, so we figure that uncertainty. Now, if you compare to that the figure that we were just speaking about, the 2.15 million hectares, if we put them finishing now at the real extent of Malaysia, then you realize that they must have been starting around more than 22 million hectares in 2000, where, of course, in 2000, Malaysia were not at, they were not 22 million hectares plus. So there is obviously an exaggeration. And actually, if you dig in the numbers, there is probably some mistakes. There is a lot of uncertainty when you do remote sensing work. And if you take the worst case each time, every year, you accumulate the worst case, then you may add up significant error in your calculations. And that's probably this kind of process that are happening, because otherwise the discrepancy of more than 2 million hectares in 2000 was is not possible. And if you look at the tree cover, the figure is even more striking. And of course, those figures are the figures that were in Malaysia, but in the 60s or in the 70s. So the extent of the discrepancy is an explanation of why you may hear from different sources, professional sources, scientific sources, journalistic sources, NGO sources, many different discourses about deforestation. So that's just an illustration of the ambient noise, that you can have, and the fact that the information can be even genuinely, absolutely taken out of proportion. So after this vision of what it is in Malaysia, and we can have, by the same calculation, the same way of proceeding, a result that what we did with my colleagues for Indonesia. So in black, you have the extent of the deforestation according to the time. And you see it's much more recent in Indonesia. The big peak was in 2000. And if you look at the extent of the palm oil, actually, the palm oil has been there around for a long time in Indonesia, but the real extension is extremely recent. It's from a few years ago that really it started to extend a lot. So the deforestation in Indonesia and the extension of palm oil is even more disconnected than in Malaysia. And in red, you have the real trend of deforestation by oil palm in the way that we reconstituted. So once we have seen those information there, and we have the real extent of what is the real trend of deforestation, and we see that in both countries, deforestation is going down. It's not yet totally finished, but it is absolutely a thing of the past, and it's not now as it was in the past. So doing the equation that all palm oil is linked to all deforestation is totally a misleading picture. And to illustrate that how we can be misled with this idea is, I represent there what about if all the 100% of palm oil that is grown today on Earth was related to deforestation? That is the worst hypothesis. 100% of all palm cause deforestation. Of course, it's not true, but let's take that extreme worst case hypothesis. Out of this, only 68% is traded. So a big chunk, 30% of it is already locally consumed. You absolutely cannot touch it by with the tools that we call trade regulation that are supposed to work on the imported deforestation. And of course, if you look at the most stringent customers, those who are really how to say, those who are really motivated to curb deforestation through trade methods, like the European Union, then what is it? Then here you have only, you realize that only 9.4, almost 10% of the production is consumed by the EU. So when you see those proportions, which are again on worse hypothesis, like if 100% of oil palm was causing deforestation, which is not true. We have seen with the previous figures that nowadays, whatever is created today is probably acting on a extremely a small percentage of deforestation. So fighting imported deforestation is certainly a very feel-good concept. But you see with those representation here, it has also a little leverage on the real deforestation processes. So now there are still a lot of people speaking about that. So you may say, okay, all of this is because palm oil industry issues with Europe is a question of neocolonialism. I heard that many times in Malaysia and in Indonesia, and we're going to question that. We are going to see that if it is true. So first, let's have a look at the global production of vegetable oil, all kind of oil, including palm oil, but also rapeseed oil, sunflower oil, all these vegetable oils on Earth. I took the picture of 2014 because I did it at the time, but actually the proportion didn't change much, so I was a bit lazy. I didn't update the map, so the proportion are exactly the same today. So you see that you have production of vegetable oil a little bit everywhere in the world, with, of course, the bigger chunk in Southeast Asia. And if you order all those regions by how much is produced per hectare, so you look at the criteria, which is the criteria of sustainable intensification of agriculture, because in a globalized world with climate change, with the more people, you cannot have indefinite extension of the area. So you have to have sustainable intensive agriculture. That means agriculture that is intensive, but that can be produced that can produce same quantity on less hectares. So if you rank all the vegetable oils according to that criteria, you see the production in Southeast Asia, which is very good on the right, and some other regions that are less performing. So it's already a way to look at the things. Of course, there is no merit for Southeast Asia, is because Southeast Asia is mainly producing palm oil, and palm oil is one of the crops on Earth that produces the most vegetable fat per hectare. So it's an easy way to be on the right side. And if you look at another criteria, which is the footprint in hectare per capita, then you see a map of the regions in the world, where I did with some humor. I hope you will like this humor. The good and the bad. I don't know where is the ugly. Maybe there is no ugly at all. So the good quadrant is on the lower right side, where you have less footprint and you have a lot of tons per hectare. On the other side, you have a lot of hectares per capita that are used, and you have tons per hectare that are not very performing. So in the bad quadrant, you have South America and North America, and with the other regions spread all over that. It is worth to note that Western Europe is not completely a bad region. It is somewhere in the middle, along with Western Asia and Central America. So now you have an idea of how those crop production regions are more or less ranked in terms of footprint, in terms of intensification of agriculture. And again, you can group all of these millions of tons to know that all of this is the production of the vegetable fat that we need on Earth. And on Earth, we have also production of economics wealth. And I represented in red that wealth. At that time, it was around 80,000 billion USD of GDP. If you take a share, even small proportion of that wealth, and you reinvest into the sustainability of the palm oil, how it will work. So let's see again, sharing those GDP by region to see how we can use our planetary wealth to help the sustainability. And then when you do that, you realize, oh, Southeast Asia produces a lot, but have a deficit, comparatively strong deficit in terms of GDP. So it looks like relatively it's more difficult for Southeast Asia to invest into its sustainability, while some other regions have an apparent excess of wealth, like Western Europe, but also Northern America in the bad corner, or Eastern Asia in the other corner. So, okay, you have a map of who can invest, where are the surpluses of wealth that could be used to invest into the planetary or the global sustainability. And now if you put that again as a map, then you see emerging a striking pattern. You see the old zone that people were calling the northern western world, which has clearly, with North America and Western Europe, an excess of GDP compared to their production of vegetable oils. While you look at the former South or tropical world, where you have clearly a deficit of GDP compared to the production of vegetable oil. And again, do not forget that all this production is, in most of the countries, is answering a local demand. Only a part of the production is traded internationally. So we have a real issue. You have production and consumption, and we have an unequal repartition of the production of the oil, vegetable oil, and we have an equal repartition of the GDP that could be available to help sustainability. And if you look at East Asia, it is a very specific pattern that is not like the Western world. That is, it has its own originality, especially because of the extremely recent and fast growth of China. So now, if you look on the same map at a different picture, which is the deficits and the surpluses of oil crop seeds. To make all these oils, you have plants, and those plants are producing seeds, like soybeans, like rapeseed seeds, and so on. And you see that you have huge surpluses in some regions, and you have huge deficits in some others. And if you put the trade on that, then you have an interesting figure. You know, most of this trade is soybean. You have also the North America road to China is a lot of canola, rapeseed. You see that Europe is attracting a lot of soybeans and a bit of canola as well. So Europe is already a consumer of oil seeds and an importer of oil seeds. But the big importer is China, and that's by far the biggest. And of course, the biggest trade is not a North trade; it's actually a South to China trade. It's a Latin America to China trade. Now we can look at the same figure, but looking at the oil, because on this figure on the oil seed, you don't see the palm oil, because palm oil seeds are not traded. I mean, you have small volumes of kernels that are traded, but the fruits are not traded. They just go from the plantation to the mill. You don't send them intentionally. So if you want to see appearing palm oil in that picture, you have to look at the oil. So it's a different picture. And then you see China becoming green, because actually with all the seeds that China imports, they also produce an excess of oil compared to their consumption. And on the top of that, they may import also oil. And North America disappears because Latin America doesn't disappear completely, but it becomes much smaller because these regions are more or less in equal in equal numbers for production and consumption. Then in the north, you realize that Western Europe is the deficit country. And in the south, the deficit are in South Asia, around India, and Africa. It's a very different picture that we had from now. And again, if you put the flows there, then the flows from Southeast Asia, from palm oil to India. India is attracting everything, including from the sunflower seed from the Russian world or the former URSS countries. And you never see, you see, however, a flow of palm oil that is going to Europe, because Europe has has a clear deficit in oil production versus its consumption. So to give a zoom on that surplus and deficit per region, here you have for every of these regions, North America, South America, and so on, in light gray the production, in a darker gray the consumption, and I did put in green square the surpluses, and in red squares the deficit. And if you look carefully this, you realize that only one northern region has a significant oil deficit, is the EU 28. So we are now in EU 27, but for the matter of comparison, I kept the EU 28 numbers. Among the southern countries, you have Southeast Asia, which is the only southern region with a very significant oil surplus. So if you look at this, then you see those two regions, it's not anymore a question of neocolonialism, especially if you realize that EU 28, having a deficit of oil, but in the same time having a strong policy of favoring biodiesel with the oil of its own production, clearly kill your own thing, to me is not really neocolonialism, it's just the trade war. I mean, not a war, but each of the regions defending their interests and the interests of their voters and the interests of their companies. This is, in my opinion, what we are witnessing with those plain facts there. Now, to go a bit beyond that, to dig a bit into this, let's focus on the food security and diet change, because this oil is mostly used for food, as we think usually. We are going to see that's not exactly true. But first, recapitulate a normal trajectory for most of the countries. See, I took the French example that dates from the late 18th century, actually, 1700 to now. And you see that from a phase of hunger to a plain energy intake, which sailed around 1900, the cereals, potatoes, pulses, all the starch increased first in terms of consumption, and then it decreased. And once the plenty of food was fulfilled, what started to increase very much was, of course, the sugars and animal products, but also the fats and the oils and sugar. So if we look at this in terms of kilocalorie, so this is the sailing that I illustrating there. And if you look at this in terms of percentage of food intakes, the carbohydrates in the same time are decreasing, and the fat, especially the vegetable fats, are increasing. And that trend that we documented with that French case here actually is seen in every country. We are going to see that. Every country follow that same evolution. So since the 60s, where we have detailed numbers, you can see that for all the world and all the countries of the world, the fat consumption in gram per capita per day did increase almost linearly with the income. So the more the country become richer, the more they consume fat. And you have the same relationship with the urbanization, because that development, that economic development, goes with people leaving the rural areas and the cities growing. So you have a correlation with urbanization as well. So if you put that in terms of developed world, developing world, and less developed world, you see that the developed world has already sailed. You know, the sailing is rich in terms of food supply. But you see that developing and emerging countries and least developing countries are still far from reaching their level of contentment, if I can say so. So if you look at all the regions of Europe and you put that in terms of consumption of fat, you see that North America is consuming and selling at a higher level than Europe. Europe is selling at a lower level than North America. So those two levels are the minimum and maximum level that I take as reference, as benchmark to where the other region of the world will go. And all the little red arrows, they are the gap that from all this region you still have to go for in order to reach the contentment of the population in the same terms that what is today met in Europe and in North America. So if you continue all of these trends up to the 2050, so you do a bit of projection, you realize that compared to 2014, the world is going to demand much more hundreds of million tons than what is produced now. So we are going to be around 450. So you have a low and high scenario, but it will be around 450, a bit lower, a bit higher. So this is the demand that is coming, and it will have to be produced by the planet. So this is also what you need to have in mind when you understand all the discourses about palm oil, other vegetable oils, and deforestation, and all the bad services that palm oil is giving to the humankind. You have behind a clear run for who is going to produce the vegetable oils for tomorrow and who is going to feed the planet. And if you look at the same at a similar trend, but you put the numbers in terms of market share, and you separate the vegetable oils into oil palm, soybean, rapeseed, sunflower, and the others, you see that the green trend is oil palm. Oil palm has, over the years, been taking all the market shares to the other sources of vegetable oil. So I would say when you look at such a figure, no wonder that some people are not happy with oil palm. It is taking the market share. So it is an economic reality. In terms of proportion, this is how it looks. Grosso modo, oil palm is representing a bit more than a third of the consumption. Soy, rapeseed, and sunflower, the other major oil crops, and then all the others are in gray under the label of others. So clearly, we have an issue of geopolitics of production, because producing oil palm in the future, it means having the land today, disposing of the land and controlling the land today. So we have an issue of footprint, we have an issue of land bank. So first, where does it grow? Palm oil grows mostly today in Southeast Asia, and you have a few other production centers, all in the tropical band. It is worthy to note that Thailand is a growing country. It is the third producer, and Colombia also in Latin America is growing very fast. So these are the contenders of the production, and in a distant future, or maybe less distant future, Africa will become the new El Dorado to produce palm oil, because palm oil is originating from Africa, and the palm oil extension are still quite limited there. And if you compare palm oil with the other countries, you see that the other oil crops, you see that they are mostly growing into temperate zones, except soybean, which is a temperate crop, has been acclimated to subtropical regions in Brazil, but not in tropical part, in the most humid tropical part of Brazil, no. So we are going to focus again on palm oil, but here on the productivity. What I told you already is here illustrated. Palm oil is the most productive oil crop in the world by far. it produces around 3.5, a little bit more, tons per hectare per year, tons of oil. And all the other oils produce less. So it's a huge advantage for palm oil. With the same quantity of hectares, you produce much more. And of course, it makes the cost of it much lower. And if you look at this in terms of footprint, to make the same ton of oil, this is the crop that demands the less land. So of course, you have an issue of competition, because if you want to increase the soybean or the sunflower rapeseed production, you need to get much more hectares than if you want to increase the palm oil production. And we discussed briefly about the urbanization, and this is something that is extremely strong. You remember that I said that there were a link between the oil consumption and the urbanization trend, and this link that is watched by serious economic actors. And the region in the world where the urbanization is progressing the fastest, it is in the developing and emerging world. So I give you here the slides of Cargill some few years ago, because it's a huge agribusiness corporation that is one of the major actors of the agri-food business in the world. And you see in their own slide that they're looking at this exact fact. They're looking at the population, you know, the middle class that will switch of different income levels, because they are going to be in the city. So you have two slides, one showing the billions of people that are going to change in terms of income level, and you have a slide of all the countries ranked by the millions of people who are going to move from rural to urban. So this is the target. This is where the consumption is changing, and this is where people are going to need vegetable oil in their diet. So it's a huge business, a huge economic incentive to follow this. And that's the main engine that is behind those vegetable oils. And this leads to what people call the land grabbing, or the global race to constitute land banks and to control the production. And in blue, you have the investors on this map. And in green, you have the countries where are the targets. So the main investors are in Latin America. We're going to see with the next slide that is no wonder. The second country of investment is Malaysia. I'm sure plenty of you didn't know that. Malaysia is already investing everywhere in the world in order to control those land banks. And if you look at number 3, it's UAE. And then 4, UK, 5, India, 6, Singapore, 7, Netherlands. So everyone is in the race. And the places where people are investing, are securing the land to control the production of the agriculture of tomorrow, it's Papua New Guinea first, it's Indonesia second. And then you have in Africa 3, 4, 5. Africa looks 3, 4, 5. It doesn't look the main region, but if you group those in terms of regional demand, then you have Africa, which is the big place where the competition takes place today to secure the land. So here, the volumes are the similar that we saw before, but they are ranked by food crops, non-food crops, flex crops, and different use of crops. So you see with the little red triangle, the places where you have the holdings that are investing, and you have the area that are invested in the different part of the world. So Africa is the big target. Now I explain who is behind that. Mostly behind that, you have huge corporations, and the 4 biggest of them are what people call the ABCD. So A is for Archer-Daniels-Midland, B is for Bunge, C for Cargill, and D is for Louis Dreyfus. Altogether, they control already 70% of the world grain market. And for example, 60% of the Brazilian soybean is dominated by ADM and Bunge themselves. And this map show you with the logos the seat of the holdings. These companies are truly world companies. They have subsidiaries all over the world, but where are their holdings? They are in America for 3 of them, and Louis Dreyfus holdings are in Netherlands. And this is the maps of for these respective huge corporations. the map of where they're operating. So in AGM, you see in, the green countries where AGM is operating, Cargill the same, Bunge, you see it in blue. Louis Dreyfus, the map is more difficult. They made it with small yellow and black signals that are really difficult to see. But to help you, I show you where they are not. None of them are in the triangle of the difficult countries. I call this the triangle of the difficult countries. So everyone is there. They are everywhere in the world, but they are not, or they are less in those triangle. It's a constant. And who is in this triangle? It is the Southeast Asian companies. Singaporean companies, you will find them in Africa and in the same triangle. You will find also Malaysian companies, and you will also find Indonesian companies. My hypothesis, there is not a fact, my hypothesis is the Southeast Asian multinationals are more flexible, more adapted to work with difficult to negotiate governments or economics that are changing quickly. They have a kind of know-how to that, and that's maybe why they are more present in that region than the classical Western companies. But that is pure speculation, it's not fact. Now, go back to the facts. We have addressed shortly the issue of European questions. We are going to go back on the European geopolitics. And we're going to see, or to question whether it is only or not only an energetic issue. Because everyone's speaking of palm use for the biodiesel, but is there only that behind? Of course, Europe has a big dilemma with the oil crops, because Europe, especially France and Germany, is the biggest consumer of rapeseed for its own biodiesel. It's a policy. So Europe, by policy, use mostly rapeseed for its biodiesel. And Poland too, and you see Austria too, and Sweden too, and Italy a bit less. So when you're in Europe and then you want to use biodiesel with oil crop, you're using mostly rapeseed. The problem is, we have seen that rapeseed is not the cheapest oil. The cheapest oil, the most productive one, and the cheapest is palm oil. So you see the dilemma coming there. And here to illustrate more, when in 2003, Europe and mostly France and Germany started to promote the use of biodiesel in order to promote the rapeseed oil, they start to defiscalize biodiesel. And of course, the gray curve is the rapeseed oil. It triggered a huge increase of the consumption of rapeseed oil until 2009, when they ended the defiscalization. But you see that the black line is the palm oil. It also triggered more consumption from palm oil. So when they were defiscalizing oil crops, they were also defiscalizing the use of palm oil. So the European people were importing more palm oil to make biodiesel. You see also a temporary bump of the soybean oil that was created by the same reason, and it was negotiated. And after that, you see the bump going down. But palm oil, it's like a clicker effect. It went up and it never came down. Just to see how it was, and it's still difficult for Europe to swallow the bitter pill. From 2003 to 2009, when you had this explicit biodiesel defiscalization, each time that the rapeseed oil price was increasing of a few euros, you had a direct increase of palm oil consumption. So palm oil was the perfect replacement material to rapeseed. And it was cheaper, and each time you have a difficulty or a spike on the price, locally price, palm oil was coming in. And when palm oil was coming in, it was not coming out. And you see in the right figure, starting from 2009, when the defiscalization was ended, the level of palm oil consumption never went down. Even if the rapeseed oil was moving, the level of palm oil consumption was not going down anymore. The European companies or refineries took taste in palm oil. And once they took taste, they stopped they didn't stop to consume it. And if I take those numbers and I put them in the feedstock of EU diesel, you see that it's not the main use of biodiesel. It was controlled. The main use was still the vegetable use grown in EU, but you see that it has increased and it never came down. So it's a huge spine in the feet of the EU politicians, because this kind of competition is clearly competing with their own homegrown rapeseed oil. Now, is it only biodiesel? Here you have a map of the main port of entry of palm oil, where it's imported in Europe. And you see that you have Spain, Italy, but the main region is Netherlands. And if you look at Netherlands and you look carefully who is using palm oil in Netherlands, of course, you will see that palm oil is redistributed into the rest of Europe. So, for example, France on this map doesn't look like importing palm oil because it comes through Netherlands, but it still goes to France or to Germany or to Portugal. But if you look in the detail of Netherlands have a high concentration of refining factories. And these refineries are not only for producing diesel, they are producing a lot of oleochemicals. And those oleochemicals have a really high added value, because you can replace many of the refinery products from the oil and gas fossil source by the green refinery. So this is where you have a real increasing industry now that is topical, and that is the knot of what is going to happen in the future years. To illustrate that, I show you here the classical refinery in black, the fossil oil-based refinery with all the molecules that you get from it, the monomers, C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6. And in green, you have the agro-resource coming from any vegetable oils, and you see that you can produce exactly the same. So in the classical refinery, you create monomers and then you do polymers from that, and you create any kind of products, aromatics and everything. And you can do pretty kind of the same. The chemistry routes are not exactly the same, but in the green chemistry, you can kind of replicate most of the products. So that's another vision of it, where you see that the vegetable oil can produce any kind of polyester, polyamides, polyesteramides, polyurethanes, all of this stuff that have a much higher value than the palm oil itself. And a last illustration of that is a slide taken from a German company that is showing their shift from fossil fuel resources to renewable resources, so including plant-based oils. And you see that they are making styrofoams and plastics, the same that were produced by petrol before. So this is the knot of how the industry is evolving in Netherlands. It's going to there. And to illustrate that issue of added value, I take an Indonesian slide where the Indonesian industry were discussing a few years ago this issue of the added value. Where is the added value? And I added to this slide in yellow the more or less where is the Southeast Asia taking its added value, mostly in the CPO and refinery, and a bit of products like chemistry, glycerin, fatty alcohol, methyl ester, and so on. And Europe is mostly taking its added value in the palm oil chain in the upper levels. Now, the real challenge at the time in the literature of the Indonesian stakeholders that were discussing the stuff is Indonesia should go in the future into taking all the added value, because plenty of the highest added value is today not really tackled by Southeast Asia. So you may wonder with that, what about COVID? Because it was on the title. So yes, COVID is something very interesting because it is an acid test that reveals it is time for Malaysia to move up the palm oil value chain. So first we start with the EU trade in goods, and where you see the dent of the COVID, the exports in blue, the imports in red, you see the clear dent that happened during the COVID region. And it was around 20-30% of drop in goods imports. So the total goods dropped by 20-30%. But on the upper graph, it is the European Union imports by year of palm oil. And you see that you have a dent also for the palm oil drop, but a very small dent, 9% only. And if you look at the export by Malaysia, you see that Malaysia didn't suffer that European dent much because the cycles of Malaysia are different cycles. So they are not hooked to the European cycle. They follow different major economics. So that is telling us that actually the consumption of palm oil in Europe is structural. It was not much impacted by COVID. And if it is not impacted by COVID, by what? It is stable now. So you can expect that in the future palm oil consumption by EU will not go down, especially because of those chemical industry that is now growing in Europe. And if you look more closely to what products, which products did suffer from the COVID, you see that food and drink were not that much impact. The raw material, yes. The energy, yes. The machinery, vehicles, and the other manufactured products did suffer a lot, but the chemicals did not. So the rather good stability of the food, drink, and the chemicals productions and imports and exports in Europe might be an index of what is the main engine of the dynamic of the palm oil demand in Europe. It is food, of course, but it is also oleochemicals. Now, we may think of Europe, but China is there. Let's look at China. China did suffer a lot of that COVID crisis. If you look at those numbers, which are the China export to different places, including ASEAN, you see that everywhere the China export dropped down, except to ASEAN. That is very interesting. The China export to everywhere did drop during the COVID, except to ASEAN. And now, if you look at USA, I look at the US imports from different places of country, from everywhere it did drop down, except from ASEAN. And Malaysia was one of the places where the sales to US did increase very much with the COVID crisis. So you have two factors behind that. One is, of course, the US-China trade war that benefited Malaysia. But you have another factor. It is ASEAN, which is the pivotal place of today's economics. And when part of the world is slowing down, part of the world is stable, ASEAN is the regulator, is the one that is the trade place, that factory make the products and resell them. And this is extremely interesting. Malaysia has already turned the next phase. You know, Malaysia is already in the post-COVID, or at least if not Malaysia, ASEAN it is, where this part of the region, where the rest of the world is slowing down, is still able to be extremely dynamic. In conclusion, I have two main messages, and I will be on time. The main message, one is, if you look at the productivity of the vegetable oils per hectares, here you have in circles, the size of the circles is the hectares that are planted of oil crops, and the colors are the productivity. So the darker, the most productive. You see the main blue almost everywhere, except that in the South countries, you have extreme productive place, which is in Southeast Asia, and you have extremely low productive place, which are in Africa and in South Asia. So if you look at this, you realize that the main challenge for the oil crops will be to finance the sustainability of the South production system, the production system of the South. That is the challenge number one. And the challenge number two is that idea of climbing the ladder value. If we want that Indonesia, Malaysia invest even more to finance palm oil sustainability, the best way to do it is to create economic surpluses by climbing the ladder of the value chain in that sector particularly, because today the top highest top of the added value segment are not made. They are not made in Southeast Asia. They are made in Europe. So it should be, we should have a transformation of the industry in Indonesia and Malaysia to be able to have its own autonomous policy and its own financing of palm oil sustainability. With that, I hope I was not too fast. I tried to fit in the time. I thank you very much for your attention, and I give floor for the next speakers, and after that we will have a debate. Thank you very much for your attention.